Good evening. Excellencies, honored guests, colleagues, students, thank you first of all for braving the weather and coming tonight. The struggle for human and political rights, for liberty, justice, and equality, for dignity and hope has a long history that does not start or end with the Arab uprisings of late. But the outburst of the resilient and persistent mass protests that swept through the Arab world in the last year is an event of historic proportions. And as the Arab world braces for change, for transition from tyranny to democracy, from corruption to equity and transparency, from despotism to justice and equality, it can learn from the lessons of other successful struggles and attempts to transform societies and polities around the world. Today's event is part of several initiatives and research projects we have launched at AUB that aim to engage constructively with and to better understand the nature and consequences of the historic changes taking place all around the Arab world. This is the least we can do in modesty in recognition of the heroic human endurance in the face of violence and brutality. The courage of ordinary human beings standing up for their rights and defending their freedoms, and the persistence of dignity and the unyielding capacity to sacrifice for the future. Tonight we're fortunate to have with us two distinguished guests who participated in the protracted struggles to transform their own societies and who will share with us some of their experiences in the course of these protracted struggles. Former President Michelle Bachelet, former President of Chile and currently Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Women, and Minister Nickolay Mladenov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria. We are grateful to our colleagues in ASQA, the co-sponsors of this event, and in particular to Under-Secretary General Rima Khalaf and to Dr. Maha Yahya for giving us the opportunity to invite today's two distinguished guest speakers. The third guest speaker, Ms. Asma Jehangir, had to leave the country suddenly, so we are sorry that she's not with us tonight. Now, just quickly, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I will introduce our two speakers and also say a few words about Dr. Maha Yahya. Then I will give the podium to Dr. Maha Yahya from ASQA to make a few introductory remarks. After that, we will invite our speakers to give a few introductory remarks, maybe for 10 minutes, of course, give and take, it's up to them to decide. Then we, Dr. Maha Yahya and myself, we will address a few questions to the two speakers, and after a round of questions, we will open the floor to you to ask questions as well, to address your questions to the speaker. Michelle Bachelet is the first Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Women, which was established in 2010 by the United Nations General Assembly. Under Ms. Bachelet's leadership, UN Women will lead, support, and coordinate the work on gender equality and the empowerment of women at global, regional, and country levels. Ms. Bachelet most recently served as President of Chile from 2006 to 2010. She also held ministerial portfolios in the Chilean government as Minister of Defense and Minister of Health. As Defense Minister and as former political prisoner during the Pinochet regime, Ms. Bachelet promoted reconciliatory gestures between the military and victims of the dictatorship, culminating in the historic 2003 declaration by the head of the army, the Chilean army, that never again would the military subvert democracy in Chile. She also oversaw a reform of the military pension system, continued with the process of modernization of the Chilean armed forces, and introduced policies intended to improve the conditions of women in the military and police forces. As Minister of Health, she implemented healthcare reform, improving attention to primary care facilities with the aim of ensuring better and faster healthcare response for families. Ms. Bachelet is trained as a doctor with graduate studies in military sciences. Mr. Nickolay Mladenov was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria by the 41st National Assembly in January 2010. Between July 2009 and January 2010, he was the Minister of Defense. In 2007, Mr. Mladenov was elected member of the European Parliament, where he sat on the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and its Subcommittee on Security and Defense. During his time at the European Parliament, Mr. Mladenov was Vice Chair of the Delegation for Relations with Iraq. Between 2001 and 2005, Mr. Mladenov was member of Parliament at the 39th National Assembly, where he served as Deputy Chair of the Committee on European Integration and member of the Defense and Security Committee. During this time, Mr. Mladenov was also representative of the European Convention on Drafting of the European Constitution. Since 2005, he has been advisor to the World Bank, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and other international organizations in Southeastern Europe and the Middle East. He has also worked with the World Bank and the Open Society Foundation in Bulgaria and Southeastern Europe, as well as an election observer in Albania, Bosnia, Ukraine, and Pakistan. In 2008, he headed the European Union Election Observation Mission to Ghana. Mr. Mladenov is a King's College London graduate with a master's degree in war studies and has a master's degree in international relations from the University of National and World Economy in Sofia. Dr. Maha Yahya is a socio-urban specialist with 2 PhDs in the social sciences and humanities from MIT and 17 years of academic and professional experience. Currently, she is the regional advisor on social policy and heading strategic and intersectoral initiatives. In this capacity, she is addressing social and urban policies and development issues in the 14 member countries of ESCWA. Prior to joining UN ESCWA, she was the director and principal author of the National Human Development Report at UNDP entitled Toward the Citizen State, and of 2 supplementary works, Education and Citizenship and 101 Stories to Tell. She is also the founder and editor of the MIT Electronic Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. And prior to joining UNDP, she worked as consultant on a wide variety of issues such as region-wide social policy analysis, socio-urban evaluations, cultural heritage, poverty reduction, housing and community development, and post-conflict reconstruction in various countries, including Lebanon, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Among her publications, she is the author of Towards Integrated Social Development Policies in ESCWA Countries, a conceptual analysis, and she is a co-editor of a forthcoming volume entitled Secular Publicities, Visual Practices and the Transformation of National Publics in the Middle East and South Asia. I will now give the floor to Dr. Yahya, and then we will proceed with the talks of our speakers.
The people want a call that has reverberated through the streets and alleyways of the Arab world and transferred its cities, all of its cities, into Tahrir squares or freedom squares. Freedom from tyranny and injustice and corruption. A call that is now being echoed across the world in its most cosmopolitan cities and repeated by those looking to a future of justice, equity, and dignity. In this region, and so far, 3 leaders have been ousted from power. Others have promised meaningful reforms that would put their countries on a path of democratic governance, while some have responded with force in an attempt to quell all signs of protest. Though the dramatic protests have taken many by surprise, the causes of discontent are glaringly obvious. It's odd that we missed that this would happen. A number of countries in the region are grappling with the long legacy of autocratic rule as well as entrenched development challenges that have accumulated over at least half a century. These include, but are not limited to, one-party rule that conflated the ruling party, presidential monarchies, gross violations of human rights, the lack of rule of law and suppression of civil liberties and freedom, and rising socioeconomic inequity. Citizens of Arab countries are acutely aware that those living in democracies tend to enjoy greater freedom, greater individual liberty, and greater dignity, and an enhanced quality of life. They are also aware that democracies are likely to establish a stable foundation for long-term economic growth and a flourishing intellectual and creative environment, the kind of environment that we have often yearned for in the past in the last several decades. In addition to improving the lives of citizens, the spread of democracy enhances also regional and global security. In response to some of these issues that I've just mentioned, at ESCWA we've organized over the past day and a half a high-level meeting on reform and transitions to democracy, where we were lucky enough to have a panel of a number of very distinguished guests, both whether policymakers, experts, and intellectuals from this region, but also from regions that have undergone these experiences. These participants discussed issues that ranged from questions of social justice and economic equity to the reform of security institutions to electoral reforms, etc. In organizing this particular panel with AUB, and we're grateful for both their excellencies actually, Her Excellency Madame Bachelet and His Excellency Mr. Mladenov, that they took the time and agreed to do this panel with us. In organizing this event with AUB, an institution and a university that has long espoused the values of freedom and democracy. We hope that this will be the first of many joint activities, many joint dialogues that we're trying to initiate around the collective challenge, the challenges that we are all going to face collectively in the next decade. This is not a moment. It's not something that has just happened now and it is going to go away in a day or two. What was started in Tunisia exactly a year ago has launched, is going to define the rest of the decade. And I think we need to be ready for that, and we need to learn from others to see how we're going to tackle these issues. I thank Dr. Ahmed Dalal, the Provost of this university, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Dr. Ahmed Dalal, Provost of the American University in Beirut, Your Excellency Nickolay Mladenov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria, Dr. Maha Yahya from ESCWA. Good evening, our friends. It's really wonderful to be here with you in this esteemed institution of higher learning, the American University of Beirut, and I am pleased to join you tonight to share some reflections and experiences about democratic transition, some overall reflections and my own experience in my home country of Chile, but also of what we have learned and studied from many other situations in the world. The Arab Spring in many media is now being called by some the Arab Fall. This makes probably for good headlines, no doubt, but I think that such proclamations are premature, and they certainly cannot be extended across the region because every country is unique. I have lived through a dictatorship and participated in a long and very difficult transformation of our society into democracy. And I must admit that I'm, if I would say, historical optimist. Well, we said that because we were in those long years under a situation without freedom. We never lost hope. We never gave up. So that's why I always say I'm a historical optimist. But I'm also realistic. And I have learned that change does not happen overnight. While it is easy and fast, once action starts to tear things down, democracy must be constructed and built from the bottom up, one block at a time. And this building of institutions, this change takes time. Just as it took time for the upheavals to manifest themselves in the Arab world, it will also take time for democratic transition. Some people think that there are similarities between the Arab uprising and transition now and the transition in Europe after the fall in 1989 of the Berlin Wall. And Your Excellency here will speak about their situation. The accelerating and infectious nature of the uprising last year is similar to that of the revolutions that brought an end to communism in Europe. But it also has some similarities with what brought an end to autocratic and military regimes in Latin America. While the protests in Europe and in some parts of Latin America, were centered on demands for freedom and democracy, in the Arab world we have seen also as a very important factor, even though it was present in other transitions too, here it was economic discontent, and so on the claim for social justice, it was a very important issue, and it has to be actively addressed in moving forward. The Arab world has one of the youngest populations, and no one watching images of the democratic uprisings across the region could miss seeing young women and young men standing strong at the forefront of the demonstrations. Change has been achieved through people standing up for dignity and justice, and for reform and participation. And this struggle and this determination continues and inspires real hope for the future. I witnessed the revolutionary events and the struggle for democratization that many Arab nations are undergoing with Chilean eyes, from the perspective of someone who endured a brutal regime. I would like to share some brief reflections on the Chilean experience, as I believe we learned a lot of lessons and we want to share those experiences with you. Chile's dictatorship lasted 17 years, from 1973 through a coup d'etat to 1990. And during that time, it wielded iron-fisted political and social control, and as a consequence, resulted in a systematic violation of human rights, thousands of deaths, tens of thousands of cases of torture, and hundreds of thousands of people forced into exile. But in the case of Chile, we must speak about the process of democratic restoration, which is important to take into account because the country had a political and social fabric that served as a support for the process. Chile had a long tradition of democracy prior to the coup d'etat in 1973. And even though the political parties were prohibited, of course, in the clandestinity, the activity of the parties, of the trade unions, of civil society, with many difficulties and with a lot of danger, it persisted. In 1980, the dictatorship enacted a new constitution that specified that a plebiscite should be held in 1988 to consult the citizens on whether the regime should continue until 1997. Of course, I imagine that the plebiscite was launched because they thought they will win. But the opposition to the dictatorship decided to participate in the plebiscite. Even though we were not confident that we'll respect the result, we decided to use that way and call the Chilean people to mobilize and vote no to the continuation of Augusto Pinochet in power. And the results are well known. The known vote won, and Pinochet simply had no choice to leave power a year later. What would I say are the key lessons of this process? And let me offer 5. First, it was so important to achieve the unity of the democratic forces. In people who want democracy, sometimes they need in terms to succeed, to put a group of important common objectives to fight for. And there are other issues that might differentiate people, but that will be another moment, another process where you can work on those things. In our case, up until 1982 or 83, the opposition to Pinochet was splintered into various groups. But the only thing that division among democratic forces does is strengthen non-democratic forces. Only as of 1984 did the process of dialogue and reorganization of the opposition around a common process begin. And it wasn't easy. My party, for example, joined the opposition strategy toward the end of 1987 because we didn't believe that it would result. But when we thought it was necessary, we went into this battle. What is important is that it took an enormous amount of political work to reach this agreement. The transition required thousands of political meetings, thousands of seminars. It meant traveling throughout the country, meeting with social leaders and union leaders, and convincing them to accept this strategy. At first, we did not even agree on how to govern once we return to democracy. But the process, in our case, of defeating the dictatorship through election was clear. That shows the importance of political leadership, because demonstrations may arise spontaneously, and that is good, but the process and the future democratic government will not. They need to be led. Second, it's necessary to agree upon the constitutional rules of the transition. In the Chilean case, there was a negotiation with the military government after the plebiscite in 1988, and before the regime left power in order to reform certain aspects of the constitution that limited popular sovereignty. And it was upon that base that the posterior democratization was built. I mean, we won the elections, but we won the election with a constitution that had several problems. And I want to clarify, we might or might not like those rules, but we decided to go with those rules and then make the necessary changes. We can argue whether these rules are more legitimate or less, because remember that in the Chilean case, the legal foundation for the transition was Pinochet's own constitution. But what is essential is to possess a framework that defines a territory, one that allows progress towards the normalization of the democratic institution building. Of course, in an ideal design, countries would decide upon certain basic aspects of functionality as they build the constitutional framework for the transition, defining, for example, a calendar of the entire democratization process from the high executive power to the local authorities. And there is no single path. In some places, like in the Arab world, they have decided to first solve the constitution and then make election in some countries. It can be the other way around. The important thing is to agree on a roadmap and to respect it. The form of government, whether presidential, parliamentary, or mixed, in our case, even though we had a strong dictatorship, we were used to a presidential system, so we maintained the presidential system. In part of the Arab world, because of the authoritarian regime, there is some fear of a presidential system, and some people are thinking on parliamentarian or semi-parliamentarian system. That is a decision that every country has to make. We have to decide about the size of the legislature, the electoral system, the definition of district boundaries, and the design of an electoral process that ensures transparency. Also, it's needed to develop electoral systems of justice. The third grand lesson is that we have to keep an eye on the long-term institution. Anyone that thinks that the institutional standardization of a country is only about holding election is mistaken. It's not enough with making a dictator to leave the power, because authoritarian governments leave their mark in many other institutions. In Chile, for example, one of the fundamental tasks of the first democratic government was precisely to bring that standardization about, change laws, modify procedures, designate new people in some institution. As a necessary measure to ensure transparency, the best tool for avoiding corruption is accountability and reform of the public administration that ensures efficiency and effectiveness. And in certain areas, sometimes, you have to yield temporarily. For example, I already said that we had to accept that Pinochet continue. We had the constitution, and he continued as commander-in-chief of the army for several years because it was stipulated in the constitution. But the ultimate goal of the democratic governments was to achieve total obedience of the military to civil authority, and it was achieved, even though Pinochet was there. Of course, we needed to reform the security sector, the judiciary sector, the public administration, and so on. Fourth, you need to bear in mind that democracy, people after a conflict, and particularly after very difficult times for people because of unemployment, because of a violation of human rights, when democracy comes, people want peace and want well-being. And it's important not to forget that often in this process the people have gone through a long period of instability and fear. The Chilean case is very exemplary. Public studies, opinion studies done in the late 80s revealed that what the people most often said they wanted was to live once and for all in peace and tranquility. Our people suffered greatly under the dictatorship, and the last thing they wanted was for the political conflict to go on indefinitely. Therein lies a call to the democratic forces in two ways. One is to prevent the emergence of violence from any side, and two, to be able to assure peace and order under the new democratic government. It's also important to achieve reasonable levels of growth and well-being for the population. And I have to be here very clear. I think democracy has to deliver. And one of the dangers of transitions to democracy is that people only get involved in the political aspect and not get involved on how it gives in the short time, but also at the short term and long term, better conditions, well-being for people. That's one of the reasons that move people. And people could get disappointed with democracy if you don't provide them with the goods, the services that they deserve and they need. And I want to tell you an anecdote in Chile, because democracy is not synonym of economical system that can solve the economical problem, social problem of the people. So when we were in the campaign for the no, and the slogan in 1988 was to Pinochet campaign was "happiness is coming." And what happened is that when first democratic government started, everybody wants yesterday everything, because that's the impatience, the sensation that democracy will provide all the solutions to everything. So because it took some time to solve these kind of issues, there were a graffiti in the walls around the capital that said, "Happiness never arrived." So I want to say this because I think it's so important to try to deliver as much as possible, but also manage expectation. And one of the important things to manage expectation is how in the democratic system that's built, how you relate to the people who were on the street. I mean, if you were also in the street, that's a more normal relation. But sometimes these processes don't include the people on the street and the new government. So how you manage expectation, it will also be through how you deal with participation of the people, because that's an essential part of democracy. So countries should be especially careful to create the conditions necessary for the new government to effectively exercise office from the very beginning, because otherwise, as I said, the public dissatisfaction with the government can turn into dissatisfaction with democracy. Fifth, do not forget that in the eyes, minds, and hearts of the people, democracy must be just. In this sense, democracy must know how to establish the truth, investigate and punish violations of human rights that occurred in the past, and create the necessary mechanism for reparation and justice. Democracy should know how to bring about justice, because there is a reason that is an ethically superior way to govern. Having said that, I have to tell you that maybe this is the more difficult thing to manage politically in a transition to democracy. Who are the ones you're going to hold accountable? Who are the ones you're going to hold responsible? Is it the perpetrator? Is it the one who gave the orders? Will this attitude endanger the whole process? Many of the transition to democracy and the negotiation, they finish with an amnesty law. So the people, the families of the victims are very anxious and very impatient because nothing happens. But these things has to be managed. It could take long. In the case of Chile, the route took several years. It began with a commission for truth that established the facts as they really occurred, and little by little the curves advanced. And because democracy is the enemy of vengeance, progress in matters of human rights must always be made within a framework of the rule of the law, although it takes time. But I say again, for me, this is one of the most complicated things. And when I look at the Arab region, I always think how difficult are some things. Because one of the objectives after a war or a conflict, and I think Lebanon has a lot of experience on this, is that you need to build and to get out of this conflict as a unified nation, that everybody feels it's part of the nation, it has all the rights and respect they need. But how then you build a unified and reconciliated nation, but on the other hand, you take charge of the past. You deal with the past in a way that the past will give you lessons so you will never repeat that past again. That, I think, is really one of the more difficult things. And finally, in addition to thinking about the democratic transition, it's also important to consider how to strengthen democracy overall. And therefore, it's important to give consideration to the way the process will become stronger over time. There is an issue of institutional strengthening, as I mentioned, but also one of promoting democratic values at every level and strengthening the participation of the people. And in this seminar we've been, there were people representing the people of the street, and they are feeling that because many of them are not in the political parties, and because transition to democracy and because political parties, maybe because today there is a crisis of the politics and all over the world. Which are the kinds of organization, institutions that will be built that will permit the participation of the majority of the people, I think is one of the challenges that everyone is living. And I think it needs to be attended in the case of particularly how these revolutions happen. It needs to be to take very serious into consideration to develop the channels of participation, the inclusiveness needed as an essential part of democracy. Because democracy is not only about voting. I know you all know that, but usually because it's obvious, we forget some things. Democracy is about elect and be elected. Democracy is about inclusiveness and representation and participation of the people. And here I would like to stress also that not only the importance of youth that I already mentioned, but also the importance of the participation of women. If a democracy neglects women's rights and participation, it's a democracy for half of its people. And I think this is an issue that needs to be taken more seriously into consideration in the Arab region. And UN Women, my organization, stands ready to further support women's empowerment and equality in the Arab states during these times of transition. Because to me, it is so fundamental, not only because I'm a woman, of course because I'm a woman, not only because I know that women can, but also because, and not only because I'm executive director of UN Women, of course, for that reason too, because for me it's so fundamental that we cannot exclude 50% of the world's humanity. Excluding 50% means, first of all, a lack of real democracy, but also, because of the great potential that women can have, it means wasting the extraordinary potential that women have to offer. In closing, let me stress that each country is unique and must be capable of a thorough self-examination in order to promote a new social and political contract with itself. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity to lay the grounds for that agreement. So it's not banal to write a constitution, because the constitution has to deal with the current issues, but also with the issues of the future, not to endanger the process. When it comes to the transition to democracy, there is nothing worse than an adherence to imported models. Democracy must be rooted and grown in native soul. Yes, there are universal values born out of the many struggles of the generation that have preceded us that we must respect. The creation of a legal system that ensures human rights, holding periodic, competitive and transparent elections, ensuring the greatest freedom of information, guaranteeing freedom of association, of assembly, and the freedom of form political parties or all kinds of organization, freedom of press, and so on. This is clear. But the final format of the transition and its timing, its emphasis, the institutions that will govern the processes will first of all depend on many factors, which was the correlation of forces that push in certain direction. I mean, who wins, if I may say, which kind of coalitions are made, the degree of common identities and goal, national consensus on agreements on basic issues, and of course the graduality or not in the process. But having said that, all this format of the transition must come from within each country itself, but it has to come to be sustainable and to be successful, from my point of view, with the greatest participation and consultation of its civil society. The greater the participation of the community, the entire community, the stronger the institution they build, and the better life will ultimately be for each and every human being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam President, for that inspiring speech and the experience of Chile, which only shows that we're all very different in whatever part of the world we are, but there are a number of things that are fundamentally the same, and that is the struggle for freedom and the struggle for democracy that unites all human beings around the world, indeed. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak tonight at the American University in Beirut. I was reminded recently of the summer of 2005, and in the summer of 2005, two things happened. Mr. Mubarak had decided to organize an election for himself in Egypt, and I took a decision to go and actually visit that election and see how it will be organized and write a report on it. As I landed in Cairo, another two things happened. I sent a text message to my mother saying, I found the place where I want to live for the rest of my life. It was at 3 o'clock in the morning. She called me back and she said, are you crazy? And somebody handed me a report, and that was the Undp Arab Development Report, which had come out a little bit before that. I read it and I found it fascinating, and the extent to which it focused on processes, on developments in the Arab world that had gone unnoticed perhaps for many on the outside world. Much later in 2011, it seemed that that report, that single report, had actually predicted to a greatest extent what would be happening in the Arab world later. Because in 2011, people woke up to realize suddenly that there were lots of angry young people in the streets of the Arab capitals, that they actually demanded democracy, that they actually demanded fair economic opportunity, because to live under $2 a day is impossible, to have a market economy that benefits only but a few is also not fair, and they demanded justice. And these are the three things on which I strongly believe that the Arab awakening is based. But what it is mostly about, it is about human dignity. It is about the dignity of the Arab people to prove to the rest of the world that all the cliches that we had gotten used to putting in sentences when we talked about Arabs were wrong. That there is no natural inclination for people in the Arab world to be governed by dictators. There is no genetic code which says that you cannot have democracy and Islam in a country together. But as these revolutions and as these changes unfolded in the Middle East, if there is one lesson which comes from transition in Central and Eastern Europe, which is vitally important for all of us to share and to ring the bell so that we can avoid many of the mistakes that many of our countries made, it is the need to focus on justice. I spoke about this morning, and I will continue to come back to this point ever so often, because people want democracy, and it is difficult to develop the institutions of a democratic system and the practices. People want economic opportunity, but it is difficult to create the regulations and the laws that allow for that economic opportunity to exist. But it is far more difficult, and it is far more vitally important to create a sense of justice in society. Unless a sense of justice exists, and particularly transition societies are very sensitive to justice, we risk seeing the benefits and the demands of what people went out into the streets to protest for not being met and not being adhered to. Before the current events in the Arab world, the Balkans, where I come from, was a region that attracted global attention with its bloody sectarian and ethnic divorce. Since the last 20 years, we in Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly we in the Balkans, have experienced transition from totalitarian to democratic societies, from centralized toward market economies, from collective communities to civil society. And there is one great similarity and there is one great difference between our region and the Arab world. And the similarity, well, there are two similarities actually. The first similarity is that what is happening across the Arab world now can only be compared in terms of its historic proportions to the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe. The processes being different, the historical consequences being different, but perhaps the scale is comparable. The second similarity, that in both cases people are fighting for their spiritual, political, and physical, in many cases, freedom. But there's one also difference. The difference is that we in Central and Eastern Europe had the perspective of the membership of the European Union as a strategic goal, as a unifying factor, as something that brought together societies, public officials, businesses and administrations. This, unfortunately, does not exist to that extent in the Arab world as we had in Central and Eastern Europe. But what we need to learn from our experience in Central and Eastern Europe is that there are many ways of looking at transition. And all of them have something right and something that helps us explain what is actually happening in our societies, and a lot's wrong. In Bulgaria, which in a recent article in the New York Times was compared to Egypt, it's a far stretch, but I think there's one particular area where a comparison can be made, is that our own transition started with an internal coup within the communist regime. And then the removal of the dictator was hailed by people on the streets as change. What many of us who were at that point on the streets of our country didn't realize that getting rid of the dictator is not necessarily equal to getting rid of the system. And 1 or 2 years later, we began to realize that you have to dismantle the system and not just the figurehead on top of it to be able to really move forward. By the time we realized that, we had come into a grave financial and economic crisis in 95, 96, and realized that to come out of this financial crisis, we really needed to break with the past. And this I always compare to, I use as an example when asked about, well, is transition in Egypt over, is it done? We're only seeing the beginnings of it, so it's very, very early to say. It's only, half the page of the first chapter has been written. This is a similarity, but there are also other similarities. I loved the stories of police stations and security services archives somehow catching fire in the middle of the night in Alexandria or in Cairo, and oops, our archives seem to have burned. We don't really know what happened in the last years of the dictatorship. This again happened very much in our own case. So there are all of these similarities. And one paradigm which we used often to understand transition in our own country was the legacy paradigm. And it tried to explain everything that was happening in our societies with the legacy of communism. It's all because of the past, basically. All our successes and all our failures were due to things that had happened before us. To some extent that's true, but very often it isn't. Others tried to explain everything with a democratic transition paradigm and came up with theories that very convincingly in the beginning of the 90s tried to explain the stages of transition. First, a country moving forward from a dictatorial rule can be considered a country in transition to democracy, and that was set as an absolute rule. Second, democratization tends to unfold in 3 stages, from an opening via a breakthrough to consolidation. There were university professors who wrote theories about this. Thirdly, a belief in the determinative importance of elections. You have to have the elections, and unless you have the elections, and that they are the dividing line between the past and the future. Or the belief that at the end of the day, it is these structural factors that are most important: economic development, history, the cultural context, the institutional environment, all of these things that are a driving force. And fifthly, a belief that a functioning state is always there and that state building and democracy building reinforce each other. That somehow, as states transition and change, they cannot weaken, they cannot reformulate themselves. All of these paradigms existed in our case, and to a very large extent they were proven wrong by reality. We also had the development paradigm. In our case, this was the prospect of membership in the EU, and the structural factors that the economy was built on, and the society was built on, government, and how government is organized and run. How accountable is the police? How accountable is the judiciary? How do you exercise civilian control over the army? All of these factors, as part of the development paradigm, at some points in time were considered more important than the democratic process. True or not, still very much under discussion. I would place my bet more with the no vote. There were others who were trying to explain everything with a paradigm of time, and believing that it is Dr. Time that cures everything, that will solve all our problems. The more time that expires between the end of the dictatorship and today, the better things will be. that we don't need to force the difficult decisions in the beginning because we have enough time to take them after that. This is perhaps a paradigm that was proven mostly wrong in all of our countries in Central and Eastern Europe. It is in the beginning the decisions need to be taken and not postponed for a later stage, because at a later stage they become even more difficult than in the beginning. Last year in May we had a conference in Sofia. It was called the Sofia Platform, in which we brought together people from the Middle East and from Central and Eastern Europe to talk about transition. And as somebody from the from Central and Eastern Europe was sharing their experience, an Arab friend jumped up and came up with, and he said very clearly, he said, look, everything you're saying is very interesting, but you sound like a woman who he's bringing up a child that is 10 years old and talking about the challenges of bringing up children, speaking to another lady who's just about to give birth and is asking her, what do I do in the next few months? What do I do in the first stages of that transition? So tell us what to do in the beginning. And perhaps our biggest lesson from that conference was to explain to people that yes, you have to do things you have to think about today, but you have to think about the longer perspective of where your society is going. Because naturally, as all of us, you will also have to face the security paradigm, and that is perhaps the most dangerous one. It is about what should be primary, whether the security or society or democratic reforms come first. And the presumption is that while there are security problems, we do not really need more democracy in the beginning. This is what many people said in a number of countries. Well, particularly in the Balkans, we had all these security challenges that we needed to deal with, so we don't necessarily need to focus on democracy. We can do that later. Now, if all of this sounds familiar to people in this auditorium, I'm sure that these people will be well aware of the countries of the Arab world and the challenges that people face today. If I may point out to a number of issues, a number of threats that we have learned to be very aware of, and I think very important threats to societies in transition. Firstly, this is the threat of the widening gap between the public and the elite. In the beginning of change, it is excitement. We're all there. We're all happy to be there. We're all expecting happiness to come, if I may use that word, that expression. But soon enough, we realize that happiness doesn't necessarily come on its own, and it comes for some and not for the majority of people. And this is a great danger for any country that has undergone change or is about to embark on transition. Secondly, there is the danger of the growing distrust of the reformist agenda. In the beginning, everything is on the table. We have to reform our societies in their entirety. We have to change constitutions. We have to change fundamental laws. We have to find the right people for the right jobs and the way to structure our countries. But as more we move forward and forward, we find that the reformist agenda gets less and less support because of a number of other political processes that have occurred in our countries. And thirdly, the greatest danger is of the emergence of majorities that are either angry or even worse, cynical about change and government. And unfortunately, in the Western Balkans in particular right now, we see this as a very important challenge. In one country, in particular, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country that has gone through terrible civil war, ethnic and religious divide, we see an ever-shrinking number of people supporting the European, or believing in the European future of their country, and often being very cynical about the future of their country. So, if I had to summarize in what is the most important lesson of our transition, it is that myths and paradigms and ways of explaining society are necessary, but not enough in explaining what is happening to our countries. We need our myths, we need our systems with which to explain how transition is undertaken and how transition happens. but we need also to understand the political context of today. We shouldn't make our judgments and we shouldn't make our political decisions based on predetermined paradigms, but on understanding what is happening politically in our societies and what is the internal logic of developments as we are part of them. And in this, I think particularly the Arab world is very susceptible, because there are a number of myths going around right now, and I think we need to challenge them in order to understand the real direction in which the Arab awakening is going. First myth is that the Arab countries are the last bastion against some sort of a global march towards democracy. That as democracy emerges in the Arab world, there will be no more dictatorships left around the world, and this is very, very wrong. We have cases of Belarus, of Central Asia, of North Korea, even in South America, Venezuela. We have other countries around the world that face challenges similar to the Arab countries. The second myth is a very controversial one as far as I am concerned, and that is that democracy in the Arab world is not possible until the Arab-Israeli conflict is solved. I hear quite often, you cannot have democracy in the Arab world until the Palestinian issue is resolved. And I would challenge that very strongly, to say that it is only when democracy exists in the Arab world and the countries of the Arab world, and a representative democracy of accountable government, that you increase the chances of resolving the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, particularly now. And the third myth is that Islamists are the main danger or the main enemy of democracy. We need to be very careful with that. We need to draw parallels and look at the history of Europe to identify how religion and politics have at times converged in a manner that may bring out certain similarities to things happening in the Arab world right now. Fourthly, perhaps, I spoke about this in the beginning, is that countries in the Arab world are somehow prone to dictatorships and automatically will switch to a dictatorship if they have no other choice. I think this is very wrong, and this comes entirely because of the political and the historical context. What other choice have people in the Arab world been given historically until now? After the end of colonialism and a brief period of democracy in a number of countries, we saw dictatorships emerge quite across the region. And last but not least, that it is those in the Arab world that call themselves Democrats and believe in democracy that are fundamental to change. I will challenge that as well by saying that I believe it is not those few in any society that espouse to the best standards that drive change, but it is the majority of people who believe in a liberal agenda, have a liberal mindset, who believe in a vision of human rights that are enshrined in constitutions and protected, that actually drive change. And this is where the responsibility of the outside world, and particularly for all of us in Europe, comes to give those who want to see the standards that we all aspire to enshrined into the laws and into the order of the countries of the Arab world. It is our responsibility to share our experiences, to tell our lessons, to tell our mistakes, with the hope and with the fight that we give a fighting chance to those who want to see institutionalized democracy in this part of the world. So, in closing, perhaps my perspective on this is a little bit different from what you would hear from others coming from Europe. But I believe that a country that has gone through its own transition, that has been subjected to the advice of others, and has had to deal with that advice for about 20 years, is much more relevant and much more applicable in what it sees for countries that go through change now. And particularly for us in the Balkans, where we have multi-ethnic societies, where we have Christians and Jews and Muslims coexist for hundreds of years, and where we are very, very sensitive to the need to preserve that societal and religious and ethnic stability. Thank you.
so much. Thank you, Your Excellencies, for extremely provocative, thought-provocative interventions. I will perhaps start by asking each of our speakers one question, and maybe Maha would like to ask also one question, address one question to each, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you, from the audience. If there is a shortage of questions amongst the audience, we'll come back and ask our own. Madam President Bachelet, I'll start with a question to you. As President, your first political crisis came in late April 2006. Only months after assuming presidency, when massive high school student demonstrations broke out throughout the country, demanding a rise of quality levels in public education. In June 2006, you set up an 81-member advisor committee, which is, by the way, what we do in universities whenever we have a crisis. We form a committee of, but not with 81 is a little too big, including education experts from all political backgrounds, representatives of ethnic and religious groups, parents, teachers, students, school owners, and university rectors. How successful was this model in identifying the causes for discontent and proposing change? And what are the lessons to be learned by transitional governments coming to power after massive upheavals that have to respond to the expectations and demands of an empowered and assertive public?
Well, the first, I would say, lesson before coming into the concrete example you mentioned is that you will never meet the expectations of people, that expectations are always enormous. And of course, governments can do the best they can. But expectations are dreams. And dreams come into practice. And I'm just going to show you another example. When I was a candidate, there was this woman in this little village, and she told me, oh, I'm just waiting that you arrive in office, because I know that the minute you are elected president, my husband will never beat me again. And I felt so terrible, because of course I could do a lot of laws and shelters and many things, but my possibility to change that particular woman's life and that particular husband's behavior was not immediate. It was not automatic. And one of the problems, and I mentioned with transitions to democracy, are two, I believe. First of all, that usually every problem is considered to be the responsibility and the, how could I say it, the consequence of having a dictatorship. And there are some things that are consequence of lack of freedom, but some others are linked to the kind of economic model you define in a country. It's not linked to if it's democratic or not. You can have a very democratic system with a model that doesn't produce any equality. So those people will be poor, will have a terrible life, and it's not because the dictatorship is there. But when people are dealing with a dictatorship, they believe that it's all because of the dictatorship. So then it will happen depending on the kind of models, if more inclusive or not inclusive, if you believe that economic growth had to go hand by hand with equality and social justice, or if you believe, like in some people believe, that there had to be a trade-off between a growth and social justice. I do not believe that. And during my government, we thought that we needed to include in order to growth, because if you had people better educated, with better health, with social justice, we call it social protection systems, you will be able to grow. And on the other hand, you growth to include. I mean, the money that you are able to produce, the income that you're able to produce in a country has to be to improve people's life. Having said that, and I have to say that when you are a candidate, you don't realize that so completely, but particularly in a country like Chile, that even though it's a democracy, it's a presidential system, so everything, the president is supposed to solve everything. So expectations are always very important. But on the other hand, you mentioned a particular crisis that fortunately lasted only 1 month, because we immediately after we acknowledged the problem, and the problem, well, and of course I had to take out the minister because he did not manage the situation well, and that's why instead of working on the issue, it was a conflict, a public conflict, an open conflict. But I'm always believed that people are not only part of the problem. I believe that people are part of the solution, and that people, and particularly students, it's not the same conflict that's been undergoing for more than 6 months during the current government. But this is now more the university. At that time it was the secondary schools. And they were right. we have a fantastic coverage of education, but a lack of quality in public schools. So you can have everybody attend to school, but the opportunities in life are very different. So they were completely right. We needed to make stronger steps. A lot has been done since we started democracy. But of course, when you have a democracy, those young people there are the children of the democracy, are people who were born after the democratic transition. They were born with the sense that they deserve rights and that they deserve the right of a better future and a right of a good education. And particularly, they want education without paying anything, but of quality. And so, if I may say, if I may use that word my predecessor used always, we were sort of victims, if I may say, of our own successes. But that's a good thing, because we are talking about students going into strike, but demanding for better quality. And I think that speaks also about the development of society. The government was not in threat in terms of falling or something like that, but we decided to deal it saying, okay, we have a problem. And we have a problem that needs to be dealt now, and we have to find solution. But the solution is not in one head. And what's an 81 number? That's my commission with the largest number. I defined a lot of reforms, the pension system reforms, through a commission too. And it was very important. And I have to say, excuse me, that if I speak a little bit too much. When I was a candidate, I said I was going to solve this kind of problem through participatory ways. And everybody and my political adversary said, we want decisions, not commissions. So you are a bureaucrat, you think commissions. But you know what happened in the pension system reform? There are so huge political and economical interests in that issue, a lot of money there, that everybody thought it would be impossible to make a reform. And in less than 1 year, we made the reform thanks to this commission. We gave them 6 months to produce a very important technical and political report. It came back to the government, and we defined which way we're going to go. And in less than a year, we had a pension system reform. And then people were receiving their new pensions, even householders, the women at the home, they receive a pension, a minimal pension, and it was done in the 2nd year of my government. So my lesson is, first of all, you should try to avoid this kind of problem. If that minister should have been aware of that, we could have started working before the kids were disappointed and they had to go to strike to raise the attention of the issue. So people who are in government need to be aware of the issues and, of course, they take decisions before. But if you had to deal with that, you can produce very good national consensus that will be then translated in Parliament into national agreements, and you can get important structural and state policy, because not only a governmental policy, we're talking about policies that will last there 10, 20 years, you can find through national dialogue and consensus of important parts, bringing together the stakeholders, and you can produce, first of all, a better policy, more legitimate, that include all the different aspects, that shows you the difficulties but also the positive things, and then you, as a decision-making, you make the best decision and you push it. And I think that Parliament has to do that job, but governments, it's a role of governments also to get and produce agreements on the essential issues of a country, of the state issues. So in that particular case, I think my experience, and we did the same issue with other important area, I truly believe that people can be part of the solution, and that and many times happens to government, and particularly to bureaucrats, that they are within walls and they forget what people are thinking and don't hear their solutions. And I truly believe that a democracy it's not only a representative democracy. It has to be a democracy with people can also have a possibility. And I had one of my best programs, not only the social protection and the child program, that was great. It's in the neighborhood. It's a housing and urbanist program. It was the same. We chose the 300 more, I would say, deteriorated or aged villages or neighborhood, and they themselves they decided which would be the more important intervention. That meant We empower the people. They have to organize themselves. They made place beside to define, because many people wanted different things. So we made a fantastic urban and housing intervention, but also with the empowerment of the people. And I truly believe that even though some people sees people, some people in politics sees the people as a threat, I believe it's a fantastic force. And if you can work that way, the legitimacy of your policies is so important. And particularly today, when we're living in a world, not here only in the Arab region, but the whole world, where the legitimacy of politics is so discussed. And everybody believes, this 99%, that there is a huge problem on the quality of politics, the quality and the kind of leadership of political parties. And I believe that because sometimes they completely get a huge distance from the real people and the real life.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Minister Mladenov, first of all, if I heard you correctly, I think I heard you argue against the use of neat models of political science and in favor of a historical approach, sort of being informed more with history, which is music to my ears. I'm a historian, and I always think we're better than our colleagues in political science. I want to build on one of the remarks, the issue of security paradigm that you mentioned. Madam President Bachelet, you once served as your country's defense minister. In periods of turmoil and transition, how does a minister maintain a proper balance between human rights and public security? And if I may ask you, you did mention the danger of thinking within this security paradigm, but could you venture some thoughts into how to actually think beyond that paradigm?
Thank you for that. I think my main argument is that both politicians and historians have a role in society, but if political scientists try to be politicians, they should forget their political science and actually be politicians. And often that is a challenge. My biggest challenge, actually, as Minister of Defense, was having to slash the defense budget by 30% in 1 year, which was a massive undertaking. But to go back to your question on the security paradigm, to us in the Balkans, and particularly after the beginning of the collapse of Yugoslavia, it became quite apparent that it is very dangerous for a society to undermine individual human rights, even if that is done under the cover of security. I'm looking for the right words in this because it is it is still quite a sensitive historic period for many countries in the Balkans. I don't want to be offensive to them, but it is also difficult for a country like Bulgaria, which stayed away from the ethnic collapse of Yugoslavia. Difficult because it only last week was the Bulgarian parliament capable and found the strength and the political will to adopt a resolution that condemns and calls a spade a spade. It calls what, at the end of the communist regime, was undertaken by the then dictatorship to effectively kick out the Bulgarian Turkish minority under the pretense of security and other factors like that, to Turkey, to expel a part of our population. This was one of the last things that the communist regime did. It was only last week that the National Parliament was able to call that ethnic cleansing, as it really is. And it has taken even a society like Bulgaria quite a lot of reflection, internal reflection, to be able to address these issues. And particularly when you speak about protecting rights and not infringing on security. It has been our historic experience as a society, collectively and individually, that every time that you undermine that very essence of the need to protect the rights of one human being, you undermine the rest of your country and the rest of your future. And I focus particularly on that one human being because one issue that differentiates us from our neighbors is the fact that our legal system does not provide for collective rights to groups or minorities. Our legal system is based on the understanding that every human being, as a human being, have the right to an education and to speak the language of their parents, etc. And if the language of those parents happens to be Turkish, they have the right to learn that in a school. If that happens to be, I don't know, Armenian or something else, they do that as well. But it is our fundamental belief that to have a secure society, you must have secure individuals. And this is often a very difficult debate, even inside Europe. Because we tend to look at these things differently based on our historic perspective and on our historic traditions. And so maybe, on your first comment, historians are a better place to understand these things. We have upheld this principle for the last 20 years. We have upheld this principle if one looks into the deeper history of our country, way back during the, way even before communism was imposed on us. But it is a difficult argument to sustain, because often the pressures that emerge if big threats occur tend to be in a different direction. Again, having lived through the fall of Yugoslavia, having witnessed firsthand the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo that Milosevic had undertaken and the struggle for the Kosovo people to regain their independence, having seen the danger that emerged about 10 years ago in a country like Macedonia, our immediate neighbor, of a split between the majority and the minority. One can trace all of that to swaying away from the interpretation within your legal system and within your political belief that citizens have rights as human beings. Indeed, we may be one of the few countries, and I've always sort of thought that it would be nice to have some time to do research on this. If you study the speeches of parliamentarians and if you study public language in a country like Bulgaria, you will realize that most often, if not always, we do not speak of people as, the Bulgarians should do this, or we promised the Bulgarians that. We always speak about the citizen. And this is part of this messaging that is very, very strong in our society. So for us, as a country, this debate has been quite different from how this debate has emerged in other countries, particularly in Southeastern Europe.
Let me add something, because I come from a political background where we thought always that delinquency and public insecurity was the result of poverty, and that if we solve poverty, everything will be solved. But of course, we have learned that poor people want security. They want to live in peaceful environment. And one of the threats of democracy in Latin America is that you have democracy, representative democracy, but there are parts of Latin America and Central America where, the maras, this sort of gangs and organized crime. After 5 o'clock, people cannot go out of the streets. So what is democracy if rights cannot be effective? Because you are, what's the difference between not being able to go after for a street after 5 or 6 o'clock because of a curfew that is given by a military regime, or because the maras or the organized crime is doing the same. So it is a very important issue also in democratic development. I mean, I'm talking that, of course, I believe that no security threat, and that's one of the things we needed to change in the mindset of the armed forces and the police forces, is that there's no security threat that can go over the rule of law. That's another thing. You have to respect the rule of law on all its issues. And of course you have to work against abuse of the police. That can be also a possibility. But really, I have to say that we have to deal with issues in democratic countries like organized crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking. There are issues of the security, not only the typical wars and conflicts. So we learn in our experience that we need to protect people's rights, and we need to ensure people's rights, and we need to ensure that the rights and opportunities that democracy could provide to their citizens is a reality. Because so security is important, but of course you have to do it in a respectful way.
If I may just, sorry for this, this has become an interesting discussion. If I may just point to very quickly 2 points. One is, at the level of, more broader policy thinking. It depends on how you define the security of your country, and how you define the threats to the security of your country. Now, in our case, we have stated in our national security doctrine that the threat to the democratic functioning of institutions within our country is a threat to national security. So you need to protect them. And I was, as I was listening, I was reminded in 2006 I was organizing a seminar for Iraqi members of parliament. And we did this brainstorming session of trying to define the national interest of the new Iraq. And with a flip chart, we were writing things on the flip chart. We said, okay, well, territorial integrity and, a state in which everyone lives, and independence, and all of these things. And somebody said, and democracy as well. And somebody else said, well, yeah, no. Democracy is how you do government. It's not how you, it's not a national interest. And then others rebelled and said, well, actually, it is our national interest, because if we take it away, we're not very different from Saddam Hussein, are we? He also wanted the territorial integrity of his country. He also wanted protected borders, and all of it. So it is a matter of how you frame it in your mindset.
Okay. We'll move on to a slightly, actually, parallel topic, which intersects with this one. Madam President, as a defense minister, a former detainee of the Pinochet regime, whose also family suffered at the hands of the Pinochet regime, not only yourself, you were in a position to promote, and you did promote, a large number of reconciliatory gestures between the victims of dictatorship and the Chilean military. If I recall, you mentioned that Pinochet stayed on for a while after you became president. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your experience, the importance, the mechanisms for the transitional justice mechanisms that were put in place at the time, the importance of these mechanisms for an effective and perhaps prosperous future for Chile. And also, what kind of pitfalls, how you see that reflected in this region? What kind of pitfalls do you see for the reconciliation of Arab citizens with their former oppressors? Is reconciliation possible at all for us?
Well, I think that this is an essential issue of any democratic transition, because, as I mentioned during my first remarks, one of the objectives of building a democratic country is to build a society, to be able to ensure to all the citizens of society that they will have a peaceful and adequate environment to be able to live, if I may use it in a word that I used before, to be happy, in terms of feel that you have all the opportunities and rights that you deserve as a person, being a man or a woman. And that means that, and it also means that you understand and think that all the citizens are the citizens of a country. and not only a part of it, because of religious, gender, or whatever reason it is, social, economic, ethnic, etc. And so one of the important things is how you are able, because you have to build that moment. It doesn't happen from one day to the other. But which are the steps you need to take in terms of being able to, I don't use too much the word reconciliation because it's a little bit a more religious word in my country. And it's also a word that means that to reconcile with somebody who has offended you in different ways, you have to forgive that person. And I cannot obligate anybody to forgive your perpetrator or the perpetrator of your father's assassination or death. In my case, my father died because of torture in jail. So I don't use the word reconciliation as a society. I used always the word, as a Minister of Defense, re-encountering, in the sense that there were parts of the nation who were in different sides. And one part of the nation saw the other as an enemy. And I think that's the kind of thing you need to change dramatically. When you see part of the nation being the majority or the minority as an enemy, it's impossible to really believe that you can work with that, I mean, you can live and coexist in a peaceful and constructive way. So the thing is that we were in the middle of the Cold War when we have the military regime. In that minute, the national securities policies were in that dimension. I mean, the one who doesn't think like me is my enemy. It's not my political adversary. It's not somebody who has the legitimacy to think differently. It was an enemy. So it was treated like an enemy to the nation in a military way. So that's the sort of things we needed to change in terms of being able to ensure that the political processes will also be hand by hand, although the institutional mindset changes that will ensure that this country will not be seeing each other, I mean, people of the country, as an enemy. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight, as I said. It will take time, but it happened. And it meant many different things. Some of them, I already told you, we started with a backpack with a lot of things we wouldn't like to start at the transition. But because of the way we handled it politically, it was possible. Because at the minute the parliament was elected, and because we had a very bad law that we're still trying to change, by the way, because they developed an electoral law where it's always 50% of the posts at the end. I'm not going to go into the technical things, but one people can be elected with 63% and the other with 30%. And it never represents exactly the proportion of the minds of the people. So why that was made that so? It was made during the military regime, so to change important things like constitution and others, you need quorums, so high quorums that it's very difficult to change. It was all done in a way that it looks, before democracy. So we have been struggling very long on that. But what we have done, what we did, first of all the institutional changes that was needed to be done. I already said we need to salaries for 1.5 years. At that time, I thought that was terrible. That was against all the human rights. But at the end, today, I understand that you have had those people with weapons, with experience, there. Without a salary, probably they had been a very destabilizing force. So it was an intelligent way from security forces to define. But that can be solved in many different ways. We also changed, of course, all the intelligence commissions, because the intelligence commissions were partly dedicated to repress the people, into the domestic repression. We changed the curricula of the armed forces and stating that the rule of law was essential. We changed the constitution, and that was very important, because in the constitution it was said that the ones who guarantee the rule of law was the armed forces. So every time they would think that something was not adequate, they will act, and they will be legally acting. So we changed it and put there that the people, the nation, is the guarantee of the stability of the rule of law and of the rule of law. We ensure accountability to civilian authorities, and of course professionalization and modernization. And one important thing we did, and I'm sort of an example of that, we understood that we needed civilians with expertise, and we developed lots of special training and courses in universities outside the country in terms of being able to have civilians, but not only civilians. It's not a matter of uniform. Politicians who could deal with defense, because defense is a political issue and you need people who are in charge. But we also, and at the beginning, did the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation. And we opened the space, like in South Africa and many other places, where victims could come. And we did it on all victims of political violence. So they were included, thousands of victims of the dictatorship, but also the police forces or military forces that have died because of the resistance, because of some attacks. And everyone was received, and trials were open, so the people could find truth, will receive justice, and then reparation. We truly believe that the only way to deal with the legacy of the past is to know the truth, first of all. Because the sensation that if you don't deal with truth and you leave it for afterward, it doesn't help, really. It makes no difference. And you need to know the truth. It can take long, because tribunals take long. Do you need justice? Because because it's not only because of a personal individual need, it's mainly a society need. If you have impunity, let me think on conflicts today in the DRC, where army or irregular armies go into a town and rape thousands or hundreds of women, and nothing happens, and they continue in command of the different units, and sometimes in the command of the regular army. I mean, which is the message that we're sending when we are having impunity? So impunity cannot be acceptable. You can have amnesty. In some countries, they have decided amnesty for some people, but that has to be the result of a national agreement. In our case, we had an amnesty law from the Pinochet regime. There was no political force because of this electoral law inside the parliament to change that amnesty law. But what happened is, through the development of democracy, judges never apply the amnesty law. So and afterwards, it's a non-law in the fact. So we would say we work with many different issues, but also at the end, I mean, and we started discussing this thing, and we made a lot of different monuments, if I may say, for the memoir, but not only for the memoir of the victims, of course, for the memoir of the victims, but also because we think that society has to learn. And new generations have to learn, because new generation didn't live that. And if they see it in the movies or in news, they think it's an issue. And if you see, and it's always a problem, if you ask people, which is the importance of human rights now in democracy, many of the young people believe it's not a problem, it's not an issue, they take it for granted. So one of the things that I really, and during being Minister of Defense, we talk about all the things. We try to solve all these issues. And I think in my particular case, as a woman, you can imagine I was a woman. I am still. A socialist, a divorce. What else? What other sin do I have in myself? But I had almost sort of, I was always joke, all the sins. So I thought with the Commander-in-Chief, will they concern about this woman? And on the contrary, because we were able to discuss eye to eye, heart to heart of all these issues, and understand the point of view, but let them understand the point of view of the society. We had a very good relationship, a very respectful but also fruitful and constructive relationship. I think they forgot I was a woman afterwards. They forgive me for that. But the thing is that there's so many things that needs to be done. And at the end, one of the last things that I did was to launch a museum of the human rights and memory, if I may say. And there we put at the entrance, and at the end of the museum, where we did not make any interpretation of reality. We only put facts, because the facts speak by themselves. They're so terrible, you don't need to put anything on it. And our message was, we cannot change the past, but we can shape the current situation, the present, and clearly the future depends on all of us. And we made a huge call that we all have to, how could I say, take care of what we have been able to build. the society and the democracy that we have been able to build. That is imperfect, that had huge challenges, but that is what we have been able to build together. And I think that is the kind of call we need to work every day in terms of not repeating the mistakes that we've done in the past.
Your Excellency, Bulgaria is a country that has gone through 2 decades of transition, often in the face of significant challenges, not least of which is inherited corruption that severely undermined trust between people and the government. Following from that, I would ask you to comment on the similarities that you see between what Bulgaria went through and what perhaps Egypt and Tunis are going through today, and also to what extent would you consider the role of the European Union as a major or a driver of democratic reforms and change in Bulgaria? I mean, could Bulgaria have come this far on its own? The question here being, do you think that political regional integration is vital for reforms, for democratic processes? This is particularly because the question of regional integration, as you're aware, has become very much of a hot topic now in this part of the world. And I know you probably want to comment also on your transitional justice mechanisms, since we were speaking about them earlier.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And let me start with your last question on political integration for the region. This goes beyond anything that has anything to do with our experience. But as things have unfolded in the Arab world, I've been struck by one thing. And it was very much highlighted by an interview that the president of Syria gave to, I think it was the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal sometime in the spring of this year, in which, among many other things, he spoke about the fact how different Syrians are from Egyptians and from Tunisians, and etc. And as I was sitting on a plane to Damascus reading this interview, I said, wow, your father must be turning really into his grave right now. Whatever happened to Arab nationalism and to the Arab nation if you go out of your way to highlight the fact how different people in the Arab world are? So I'm saying this to get to the point that I think it is important particularly for countries in the Arab world that embark on a road to democracy, to not only highlight the differences that exist between their societies, but also to look at the commonalities and perhaps come up with some of the integration mechanisms that we in Europe have developed. And I know that not just in the Gulf, but in other parts of the Arab world, this is an interesting discussion right now. Role for the European Union in terms of our transition was massively important because it exemplified not only it exemplified two things. It exemplified where you want to get to in terms of a society that guarantees social justice and that guarantees opportunity and that guarantees the prospect of having a safe lifestyle. But it also was exemplified where you want to go back to, a return to your natural family of cultural and historic friends and partners, from which many of us in Central and Eastern Europe believed we were taken away from as the communist Soviet armies marched across our region. So to us, it was a combination of these two things. We want to be part of this community because it was based on the values that we aspire to, but it is also the community where our natural family and friends are. And through this, I want to get to answer your first question, that one of the most driving forces in European integration for our countries was also something which we lacked in the beginning of transition in the early 90s. And we lacked very much, and we missed strongly And this was rule of law. And this was a society that functions on the basis of rules, regulations, and laws, not of privileges, not of who knows whom, and how close they are to the party of government. In a number of ways, it exemplified that, and it was a driving force for change. There was a flip side to it, unfortunately. And that was a flip side which we discovered only too late, that in this drive towards the European Union, all our society's energies were focused on becoming part of the European Union. Reforms and legislation that was taken in Parliament was only that part that was needed for the accession process. And unfortunately, there is no acquis communautaire for education, for healthcare, and these areas sort of remained on the back burner until accession was completed. And this is where the biggest challenge at the end emerged. That because we didn't understand in the beginning the justice and the need to have a strong, independent judiciary that guarantees both the rights of people, but it also guarantees that contracts be implemented, that is fair, that is based on rules that are accountable, that we didn't understand in the very beginning how important this is. We thought this would sort of happen naturally, and it didn't. And it takes a huge and a massive effort. And in a way, this is the source. This is one of the biggest sources of why corruption and criminality in a number of countries in the Balkans emerged from. Not the only one, but one of the main sources. So this is why maybe in our discussions of transition we have this natural bias to say, look, you have to focus on justice. Unless you focus on justice now, be always reminded that this is the most important issue, that people went out onto the squares of Cairo or elsewhere, they really wanted justice. And if they're feeling that justice has not been served and preserved, they will go back into the streets and they will be disenchanted and they will either become cynical or angry or other things. And unless you have that system, and perhaps this was very much in the gist of your question, it undermines the trust in government, and it takes a huge effort to rebuild that trust in government once it has been undermined. And there's one last point on this in terms of dealing with the legacy of the regime, and I sort of briefly mentioned this morning in the earlier discussion we had in the conference. It is important to dismantle the infrastructure of the regime very much early in the beginning, because if you do not do that, those infrastructures tend to come back in different forms. They change their suits, they change their haircuts, the company name is different, but they re-emerge and they use the old mechanisms that have existed in the past to pressure people, to elicit favors, to do everything that is beyond the law. And in how you deal with this in Central and Eastern Europe, there's a massive experience, and it's very, very different. In some countries, lustration laws were put in place, saying if you belong to that party or you were part of its security services, you cannot hold public office. In other countries, this wasn't the case. In some countries, early on, it was decided to make all these files and the history of this period open and publicly available so that people can take their own decisions and make their own judgments. In other countries, it was decided that there would be legal consequences for what had happened under the previous regime. We as a society struggled intensely with this process. Indeed, only a few years ago did we get to the point at which a law was adopted saying all the files of the former security services will now be opened, so everyone can go and read everything in those files, because time has passed and you can read them and you can figure out what the mechanisms of the dictatorship existed and how they worked. But getting back to the initial point, it is important to dismantle this not only in words, but in de facto, in fact, in reality. Unless you do that, you create a danger that sometime down the line, through those old mechanisms that have been retained, opposition will emerge, but not a political opposition with a different agenda, but opposition to the very system of the fundament of democracy. And it will begin to undermine it. And this is one factor against which I think we all had to protect ourselves. And it is also important for countries as they begin their transition now to understand that this is something that they'll have to protect themselves very, very quickly from.
We'll now take a few.
Then you mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or question. And you know, in this part of the world, we have a problem with Western democracy when it comes to justice. Because, as you know, Western democracy created Israel, and they created this mess. And it's very hard for us to understand linkage between democracy, particularly Western democracy, and its values, core values, and Palestinian question. You mentioned also that one of the myths in the Arab world that first we have to solve the Palestinian question and then come to democracy. I don't believe that. I think dictators and regimes in this part of the world use Palestinian question and they hijack it to undermine democracy in our region. So I'd like just to understand more, and I think we need an explanation about your statement in terms of democracy and justice and what goes first, particularly when it comes to the Palestinian tragedy.
So also my question to Your Excellency. Yes, I'm so glad to hear you dismantling this mess of relationship between democracy and Palestine. I grew up in Syria. We were smashed in the name of defending the national borders, etc. But this is in terms of value. That democracy is a universalistic value, yes. But in terms of a practice, actually there is a relationship. There is a relationship in the sense that we need the help of democratic countries to help us to end up this dictatorship. But these democratic countries, they have you cannot promote democracy in the same time voting in the UN against a basic Palestinian human rights when Europe and United States is really going so far supporting the Israeli colonial practice. And I would say I'm very surprised to see Bulgaria, for instance, the difference between the previous position in the time of dictatorship and now the free democratic Bulgaria. So help us to reach our democracy by really being more balanced in your position vis-a-vis this conflict.
Thank you very much. I was absolutely sure that I'd get these questions asked. That's why I really wanted to just highlight it and perhaps cause a bit of a stir. Let me try and separate my answer in two parts. Firstly, it is not just me, but everyone in Bulgaria believes that you need a contiguous Palestinian state that exists in peace, in democracy and security with its neighbors. There are absolutely no questions about that. There is no change in that position. We have not decided anything other than that. We fully back a Palestinian state. And I think there's been a lot of investment which has been done over the last many years in building the institutions for that state to function. It will always have our support, not just ours, but everyone in the European Union. What I meant when I spoke about the myth that democracy in the Middle East is impossible without a peace between Israel and Palestine is exactly what you said. The issue of Palestine has been massively abused by every single dictatorship in the Arab world, to the extent to which I'm really not sure if you throw the shoe up in the air whether it would fall on the responsibility of the West or it would fall on the responsibility of dictators that until recently were in power in countries in the Middle East. I believe very strongly that if you are to find peace, and a peace that is just and a peace that is actually sustainable, you cannot do it with a government in an Arab country that is not elected and that is not representative of its people and that doesn't have the full backing of its people. Because if you were to believe that, it would mean to say that stability in the Arab world comes only out of dictatorships. And this is where I think for many, many years, many of us in Europe, in the West, call it as you wish, had it all wrong. Because policies were based consistently on the belief that, or even if the belief was not stated publicly, that you need a strong person, a strong dictator in a country to be able to engage that country and hence to find peace. And I believe that exactly the opposite is true, and it's very risky, because people will say, well, if you allow the street to vote, if you allow public opinion to form government policies, particularly in issues of peace and war in the Middle East, you would get into all kinds of trouble. There's a belief like that in a number of countries. But unless you do that, unless you really go out and explain to the public at large, whether it's in Egypt, in Israel, in Palestine, in Jordan, in Lebanon, anywhere, in Syria or wherever, what are the real benefits of peace and how you can actually achieve these benefits, and make that part of the mainstream discussion, you will not be achieving anything. Because one dictator will change with another dictator, one policy will change with another policy. And if you really want a fundamental solution to this problem, it is only when it is based on popular consent. And popular consent comes only when government is responsible and accountable to its people. I remember in Egypt having long discussions with people years ago who were in total denial that Egypt had signed a peace treaty with Israel, and that we're actually trading and selling goods and services and gas or oil or whatever it is that goes through the pipeline, and all of these things, who were in complete denial in this. Why? Because the regime had created a public perception which didn't really match its policies. And is this sustainable? No, it wasn't sustainable. It's not sustainable. You really need to have that, the substance of that built on popular consent. And just to address the first question which was asked, I don't believe that it is Western. I don't think you should equate democracy in Europe as the source of the problems between Israel and Palestine. I don't think that's fair. And I don't think it's fair to speak about Western democracy as being directly transferable or applicable in countries outside of Western Europe. Because if you look at the fundament of democracy in Europe, you will see that there are fundamental values which are there, but that there are practices which are quite different. And I hope that as democracy emerges in a number of countries in the Arab world, we will see those fundamental values being the same, but perhaps the practices will be different, and the institutions will be different. because the cultural context is different, the history is different, etc. But the belief that you have to have a strong protection of human rights and strong protection of individual freedoms must be, and rule of law and accountability of government must be at the core of the values. And these values are extremely important to any society that we live in. So perhaps this is a long answer to a very complicated challenge, but perhaps somewhere down the line in that challenge, those who fear, those in Israel who fear that the Arab Spring and democracy in the Middle East will be a terrible disaster for them, and those who fear that government in Israel is becoming more radical, etc., will be a terrible disaster for the others, need to be challenged precisely on that assumption, that unless you really have strong, fundamentally accountable governments, you cannot have peace. The strength of the Palestinians and the strength of the Palestinian movement right now is the fact that they have created strong institutions that Prime Minister Fayyad and others have been involved in fostering strong institutions that can make a functioning state function tomorrow. If it was decided tomorrow a state is born, it functions. It is not going to be a failed state. And this is a very strong basis for all of us. And I think both in Europe and outside of Europe, there is a lot of support for this thinking.
Our guests have had 2 very long days, and we're really grateful to them for giving us more of their time tonight. I'm sure you all will join me in appreciating their extremely thought-provocative interventions and comments, and please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.